So I'm going to talk about the Dallinger high-level API. So most of what you've been seeing as far as running Dallinger has been directly going to your terminal and typing Dallinger debug or Dallinger sandbox. And the Dallinger high-level API is pretty useful because you can essentially call a Dallinger experiment from a Python script. And that allows you to do some really interesting things because after the experiment runs, the data is now available to you within a script. And so you can kind of iterate through multiple Dallinger experiments within one script. And so if you go into the documentation actually and you search, if you search high level in the search doc, so if you go to docs.dallinger.io, you can actually see a little example of how this works. But anyway, so I'll just show it here. So Dallinger is normally invoked with the command tool. And yeah, so the API blocks execute experiment and returns final data from the experiment. So if you look at the documentation, you can see an example here. So this fully runs a Dallinger experiment. It'll run the Bartlett demo. If it doesn't run on your computer, you might have to go and there's in the developer installation, you have to download the Dallinger demos package, which I can show you how to do. It's actually right here. At the end, you have to pip install the demos from the Dallinger directory. And this information is in developing Dallinger setup guide. It's like the last line of it. So once you install that, you should be able to run like this line of code. You may need Odo, which also is probably an optional installation in the developer installation. But anyway, so what you see here, you define your experiment, and then you can run this experiment.run function, which takes in as parameters config variables. And so these config variables for your particular experiment, they can do whatever you want. For the demos, there's a set config that we have actually. Let's take this out.
So one question.
Yeah.
The mode parameter. So here it says mode live. How does that relate to sandbox or debug?
Sure. So live is when you're running an actual live experiment. So you're not using MTurk sandbox. So you're using MTurk like a real experiment.
So it's like the Dallinger deploy.
Yeah, exactly. It's Dallinger deploy. So right here, I just did like I'm listing what's in the config in my Bartlett demo, and it'll show you mode, which is what you were talking about, live or sandbox. These are all predefined config variables for the Bartlett experiment, and these are all valid hyperparameters for the Dallinger.run function.
So every config parameters that is configured can be modified with this API? So you don't need to support that specifically by writing something in the top of the experiment. It's already supported.
I believe so, yeah. So I think most of these are already by default. Is that what you're asking? Like if you have your own experiment?
So if I want to have my own experiment, and that experiment really works with, I don't know, with a parameter here. So it needs to be registered properly, but once that works for the other stuff, then I can also set that parameters programmatically, and it will just work.
Yeah. I think this has some cool functionalities which we'll talk about. And actually, this going back to the documentation, it actually shows you how you can kind of like iterate through the experiment. So so all parameters in config.txt. Are passed to the .run function. But what's nice is like here's an example. This block of code shows you how you can iteratively run through multiple experiments. So you're running a for loop across 10 experiments, and Um, yeah, and the number of participants actually is changing for each experiment. So this is like a very basic use case, but you can do some pretty cool things with this information. So what you can do, I think that's really cool, and some stuff that we worked on, which I think is in the other slide. Probably the least efficient. Okay, yeah. When you have a parameterized experiment and a function that returns a numeric value, yeah. So the graph relationship between parameters and the result in fitness. For iterated drawing, this could be a measure of accuracy. So I'm not exactly sure what this example is demonstrating as far as.
It's just the same as the one you showed in the documentation.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. But yeah, you can do some really interesting things once you get the results from a participant. So you can run an experiment, you use the experiment data as a means for manipulating the hyperparameters for the next experiment. And actually, I've run a pretty complex experiment doing this. Well, it was more of a, it wasn't one with real participants, it was more with bots. But this allowed me to, let me just show you an example. So this is in the documentation. It's just like the most basic example, and you could probably do this without even having to specify the config here, because it would just use the original config. But I ran a interactive evolutionary computation Python script that was using the experiment.run function to use for each participant. So what happened was that we created experiments that upon the initial generation of experiments, there would be hyperparameters that were randomized, kind of like a genome is what we would call it. And based on those randomized hyperparameters, each experiment at the end would meet some threshold of like a fitness function, depending on how it met this fitness. So, for example, in our experiment, we were trying to optimize for how fun someone might think an experiment is. So at the end of a questionnaire, we would get the feedback from participants within a generation, and dependent on how their genome, the relationship between that and the success, their success and how they met the fitness function, the next generation would then be generating, based on the success, like some distribution of the most fit candidates from the prior. And so this would continue on until hopefully you would get the hyperparameters that led to the most fun experiment, which, and that's like an example of something that could be done. Obviously, there are many examples of like how you can manipulate, if you wanted to just, anything that could be like a numeric value, you can turn it into something that's something that can be iterated upon. So, yeah. Okay, and this is a different experiment that Jordan, myself, and a collaborator at Washington University, St. Louis, Gustavo Malcolmez, he works a lot with this thing called Bayesian active model selection. So this is more like high-level stuff that kind of might like exit the area of Dallinger necessarily, but it shows how Dallinger could be used to run something complex like this. So what BAMS does, and there's a whole repo for it, is it allows for, so it automatically selects experiment parameters, trying to model input to output. So based on predefined inputs that an experiment might manipulate, these inputs are changed each trial in order to understand the relationship between, in as fast as possible, understand the relationship between input and output. So an example that we were using was like a numerosity experiment. And you would give the learner multiple hyperparameters as far as like the number of dots that in this like numerosity dot experiment, the number of dots that can be manipulated, the contrast of the dots, and the you can manipulate multiple things, but the idea here is that the active learner would learn that based on every time it was manipulating the number of dots on a screen, it would notice that a participant guesses somewhere in that general range as far as how many dots. So figure out this linear relationship, and this would be like the most simplistic example of how you can have sort of this learning component to a Dallinger experiment using this experiment.run function.
And how do you get the data? If you want to get the data, you do what Jordan described earlier on. You just get the import data and then get data from the URL. If you need to compute something from the results, so you just basically get the data.
With this API, it's actually it's the return value from the run function.
But so it requires the experiment to finish.
Yes.
So the idea is that it's literally like a Python script that you run, and you press enter, and then it just blocks on your computer until that data gets returned, so until the experiment is finished. That script is running, say.
Yeah.
I see. That sounds brittle. Okay. So if my laptop were to die, does that affect my experiment at all, server side, on Heroku or anything? No, it just affects my running of that script. If I were to rerun that, is it gonna rerun the experiment from scratch? Like if I say, oops, my laptop died, I have this script, and now I press,
Default, yeah.
by default, so it's gonna rerun, okay. No?
It depends on whether you use the run function or the select function.
Okay,
One of them runs it anew. One of them, you give it the ID, and it has the logic of, like,
I see, check if
it exists. If it exists, return that one. If it doesn't, create a new one.
I see, so that's what collect is, so, okay. So collect is like run as well, right? Collect will do run once if it hasn't been done already.
Yeah.
Okay, and it's still blocking. Okay,
But I think you can access.
interesting.
You can access the database online anywhere with a separate thread, and maybe gather the data as it is being created. And
Yeah.
it could be possible.
You can request the data from a running experiment using this high-level API, just the same as you can with Dallinger export.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I am a bit interested in is, should we start putting some more asynchronous things in here? But I'm not sure that it's valuable.
Another way you can run it very simply would be to run a script that checks, like that. You guess just in the for loop, you would check whether certain things already occur. So, like the results of this experiment at stage 1 would give you a CSV file somewhere, and then you check if this CSV file is there. You just use the loop and just basically use the data, consume the data from there.
Yeah,
and only then run. And then if you Control C, well, of course, that particular experiment, it's running, but you lose nothing. So I think like these few lines of code. Maybe it would be nice to have an example of that. But like this is what I do when I run like against a cluster or something like that. And I'm not sure whether the resources can be complete or something like that. But I have a script that just go and get the resource from the clusters and then is doing this managing in my local computers, and if I stop the local computer, I can rerun it and we'll just keep going. So I think it's pretty straightforward to do it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So using the collect function is a way of doing that because it allows you to sort of effectively ask Dallinger seamlessly, run this or just return immediately with the data
Yes.
if you've already run it for me.
Yes, and then the loop you will do is another level of.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is what I was explaining. And back to this BAM's library. Here's just an example of how this is running. So you define an oracle, and so this is very specific to the active learner. But essentially, what it's doing here is using the experiment.run function as a hyperparameter input. In this example experiment, it was just think of this as the input, and it's seeing based on some sort of environment of the experiment or some sort of like thing that users are interacting with, how that affects the score, and then learning the relationship between manipulating this and what the score is in as fast as possible. These are all kind of specific, what strategy you're using, how many times you're running it, how you're modeling your kernels and your depth, and then the input dimensions or the dimensions that are being manipulated by the learner. So this is like something we're actively working on as like a separate research area for applying Dallinger to run these types of experiments.